By the fourth night of the worst winter storm Ashford Hollow had ever seen, everyone believed the old ranch was finished. The roof was shaking. The animals were freezing. A newborn calf was fighting to survive. Inside that collapsing barn stood a widow, her two children, and the same stranger everyone had rejected 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks before the storm, he arrived with nothing. No money, no home. Only 2 hungry children and one desperate request.
Give my kids milk, and I'll fix whatever winter destroys.
People laughed at him. They called him useless. But they didn't know the man they turned away was about to become the only reason that ranch survived. Welcome back to SM Stories. If you love slow burn love stories built on strength, survival, and quiet devotion, you found the right channel. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and let's begin. Late October, 1889. The prairie wind had already turned cold enough to bite through cloth. Caleb Ashgrove pushed a battered handcart along the frozen wagon trail, one hand gripping the worn handle, the other pressed against his daughter's back to keep her steady against his shoulder. Little Ruth was barely a year old. His son, Tobias, 9 years old, walked beside the cart without complaint, though his boots had worn through at the toes weeks ago. Caleb had once worked as a carpenter and wheelwright along the rail lines, fixing whatever broke, wherever it broke. That life ended the day his wife, Sarah, died of a fever that took half the camp with her. A man alone with 2 small children had no place in a repair crew that moved every few weeks. 3 homesteads had already turned him away that month. One only wanted a hired hand, no children allowed. Another gave them a single night's shelter before pointing back to the road. A third told him plainly that a girl that small would be easier to raise in an orphan home in the city. Caleb kept walking. The night before he reached Cedar Hollow, Ruth wouldn't stop crying from hunger, and Tobias quietly slipped his own piece of bread into his coat pocket instead of eating it, saving it for a tomorrow he wasn't sure would come. Caleb saw him do it. He said nothing, but something inside him hardened into a decision. Whatever came next, he would not walk away from another ranch empty-handed. Cedar Hollow appeared over a low ridge just before dusk. A modest ranch house. A barn with a roof sagging dangerously on one side. A corral fence leaning at an angle no honest fence should lean. And in the yard, a woman breaking ice from a water barrel with the flat of an axe. Naomi Whitcomb had run Cedar Hollow alone for 2 years, since her husband Daniel was crushed beneath a collapsed grain silo. She wore her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, her hands calloused from work most women in town would never touch. She looked up at the stranger and his 2 children and asked only one question. What can you actually do? Caleb answered without wasting a single word on his own story. Carpentry, roofing, fence work, wool repair. Whatever's broken on this place, I can likely fix it. His eyes drifted to Ruth, who had stopped crying only because she no longer had the strength to keep it up. Give my kids milk, Caleb said quietly. Let us sleep somewhere warm tonight. I'll fix whatever winter is about to break on this ranch. Naomi studied him, then glanced toward her barn roof. What makes you think anything here is broken? Caleb pointed without hesitation. Your barn roof is sagging on the windward side. That corral fence is leaning because the posts were set too shallow. And that water barrel wouldn't need breaking every morning if the drainage ran the way it should. Naomi said nothing for a long moment. Then, without answering him at all, she walked forward and gently lifted Ruth from his tired arms. The milk comes first, she said. Everything else can wait until morning. Inside the small kitchen, Naomi warmed fresh milk and fed it to Ruth herself, while Caleb sat frozen with exhaustion. She placed a full plate of stew and cornbread in front of Tobias, who ate carefully, and true to habit, tucked away a piece of bread when he thought no one was looking. Naomi noticed. She said nothing. She simply set another piece beside his plate, as if it had always belonged there. Over the quiet meal, only the necessary facts were exchanged. Sarah had died 5 months earlier. Daniel had died 2 winters back, crushed under a grain silo that should have been reinforced the previous fall. Naomi had no children of her own. Cedar Hollow was behind on debt after losing half its herd to a hard winter the year before. That night, Naomi brought down an old wooden crib from the loft. One Daniel had started building years earlier and never finished. One rail remained unsanded, rough beneath the fingers. Ruth slept in it peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tobias fell asleep, still guarding his hoarded bread in his coat pocket. Before sunrise, Caleb was already outside, walking the property in silence. He did not touch a single tool. He washed first. He tied a strip of cloth near the barn door and studied how the wind curled through the gap. He dug beneath the hay pile and found the bottom layer damp and beginning to rot. He tested the corral posts with his hands and found two of them loose in ground that had never been packed properly. Naomi followed a few steps behind, arms crossed, watching him work without a single hammer in hand. "You've been out here an hour," she finally said, "and you haven't fixed a single thing." "That roof isn't failing because the wood is bad," Caleb answered. "It's failing because the ridge beam was never braced against the wind coming off that ridge line. Your hay is spoiling from the bottom because it's sitting straight on wet ground. And that fence will fall the first hard freeze heaves the soil because the posts aren't set deep enough to hold." Naomi's jaw tightened. Daniel built that fence. He wasn't wrong for the ground he had, Caleb said carefully. But frostline shifts. Ground that held a post 5 years ago won't always hold it now. Something in her expression softened, just slightly. 6 weeks, Caleb said. Hay first, then the fence, then the roof, then whatever the weather shows us we missed. Naomi pointed toward the tool shed. "You get 1 week," she said. "Then I decide if you see real problems, or if you're inventing work to earn your keep." Caleb began with the least controversial task first. Together with Tobias, they pulled apart the bottom layers of the hay pile. A sour, damp smell rose immediately, confirming exactly what he'd suspected. He built a raised platform from old fence rails to lift the hay off the ground, dividing it into smaller stacks with air gaps between each one. Tobias's job was simple. Measure each gap to match his father's marks, and count them aloud. It was the most he had spoken since they'd arrived. Next came the corral fence. Caleb reset the 2 loose posts nearly a foot deeper than before, packing the base with crushed stone he hauled up from the creek bed himself. By the 3rd day, an older neighbor woman, Agatha Pruitt, stopped by with a jar of preserves and quiet gossip. "Everett Cross has been asking about your new hired man," she said to Naomi. Naomi didn't respond. Agatha left the preserves anyway. Along with a spare loaf of bread she set beside Tobias's plate without a word. That afternoon, a rider approached the fence line and stopped without dismounting at first. Everett Cross, the wealthiest rancher in the valley and Naomi's long-standing rival, looked over the reinforced fence posts with an amused expression. "So this is your drifter's handiwork," he said, nudging a post with his boot. "Deep holes don't fix a fence built on bad ground." Caleb straightened. The ground wasn't the problem. The depth was. Everett turned to Naomi. "Since when did a wandering carpenter become foreman of your ranch?" "He's not a wanderer," Naomi said evenly. "He's my foreman, until his work says otherwise." Even Caleb looked mildly surprised at the words. Everett smiled thinly. "You'll still need my grain mill once the roads freeze over." "If you have business," Naomi replied, "put it in writing." Everett rode off without another word, muttering that winter would decide who was wasting their time on this ranch. Tobias watched the rider disappear over the ridge before turning to his father. "What if he's right?" Caleb picked up another post. "Then we fix it before winter proves him right." The first hard wind arrived sooner than expected, and it exposed a flaw immediately. The barn roof brace Caleb had reinforced held on one side, but on the windward corner, the wind caught beneath a loose shingle edge and began peeling it back, piece by piece. Naomi watched from the yard, arms crossed. "It's failing. It's telling me where it's weak," Caleb answered, already climbing the ladder. He restitched the corner brace, this time angling it against the direction the wind actually traveled, rather than the direction he had assumed. By evening, the roof held firm through a gust that would have torn the old shingles clean off. Naomi climbed halfway up the ladder to check his work herself, her hand resting briefly against the new brace. "You didn't guess right the first time." "No," Caleb admitted. But you fixed it before the storm found it first, she said. That matters more. A week later, Thomas Reddick, the county land and livestock assessor, rode out to inspect the changes he'd heard about from town gossip. He asked difficult, pointed questions. Could a tighter barn trap dangerous moisture? Could deep, unturned bedding build up harmful gas? Could a poorly placed lantern near dry hay become a fire risk? Caleb answered each question honestly, admitting what he didn't yet know. Together, they inspected the ridge vent, tested the bedding by hand, and checked the distance between the new hay platform and the lanterns hung nearby. Before leaving, Reddick made one request. Keep a written record. Morning and evening temperatures. Firewood used. Hay fed. Any repairs made. Naomi hung a ledger by the kitchen door that evening and handed the pencil to Tobias. Write today's numbers, she said. From that morning forward, the ranch's progress would be measured in facts, not opinions. While Caleb worked outdoors from sunup to sundown, Naomi cared for baby Ruth without any fuss or announcement. She warmed milk, changed blankets, and paced slow circles near the stove whenever the child grew restless. At first, she held Ruth stiffly, unfamiliar with the weight of a child in her arms. But slowly, something shifted. Ruth stopped crying the moment she heard Naomi's boots cross the floor. Small fingers reached for the collar of her coat. More than once, she fell asleep against Naomi's shoulder while Naomi recorded the day's numbers in the ledger, pencil balanced carefully in her free hand. One evening, Caleb stepped inside and found them exactly like that. He reached for Ruth. Naomi shook her head gently. She just fell asleep. He set his gloves by the stove instead and walked back outside. On another quiet afternoon, Tobias helped Naomi shell dried beans into a wooden bowl. After a long silence, he finally asked, "Why don't you have children of your own?" Naomi kept her eyes on her hands. Some rooms get built and never get filled. Tobias glanced toward the crib in the corner where Ruth slept soundly. That one's filled now. Naomi said nothing, but her hands stilled for a moment before she went back to shelling beans. The next morning, Caleb noticed something quietly remarkable. Tobias's leftover cornbread sat untouched on the table. For the first time since his mother's death, the boy had gone to sleep believing there would be food tomorrow, without needing to hide it first. The first true cold snap struck without warning. Temperatures dropped well below freezing overnight, and by morning, it delivered the first honest test of everything they had rebuilt. The reinforced barn roof held steady, keeping the interior warmer than it had ever stayed the previous winter. The raised hay platform kept the feed dry and free of the sour rot that had plagued it before. But the water barrel, despite Caleb's repairs, froze solid by mid-morning. "I missed something," Caleb admitted, breaking the ice free with an axe. Together, he and Naomi rebuilt the drainage channel beneath the barrel, angling it steeper so no standing water remained overnight to freeze. They packed the exposed pipe joint with dry wool and wrapped it in tarred cloth for insulation, working well past dark. Naomi brought out 2 cups of hot chicory coffee. Caleb accepted his without meeting her eyes. "I said I'd fix this ranch," he murmured. The water still froze. "You said you'd fix it," Naomi replied evenly. "You never promised to get it right the first time." The words settled into him more deeply than the coffee ever could. By morning, the water flowed freely and drained properly overnight. For the first time, Caleb understood something that had nothing to do with pipes or roofs at all. Naomi wasn't measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed long enough to fix it. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled steadily, one line at a time. Every morning, Tobias recorded the temperature. Naomi added firewood used, hay fed, and every incident of frozen water. Slowly, the numbers began telling their own story. Firewood use had dropped. Hay spoilage had all but disappeared. The water barrel had not frozen solid again. When Reddick returned to review the ledger, he read every entry carefully before closing the book. "I wouldn't call it proven," he admitted, "but it's doing exactly what it should." That same afternoon, Everett Cross rode in with a proposal of his own. "When the snow closes the roads," he said, "my grain mill only stays open to ranches that agree to sell their herds through me at my price." "No," Naomi answered flatly. Everett shrugged. A few cold mornings aren't winter. After he rode off, Caleb asked only one question. How many days of feed do we have if his mill closes to us? 18, by the old numbers, Naomi replied. Longer, if the ledger's right. Caleb studied the darkening sky. We prepare for 25. Naomi opened the ledger, wrote the number down, and drew a firm line beneath it. From that moment, Cedar Hollow prepared for the storm they hoped would never arrive. 3 days before the storm, the cattle refused to graze, turning their backs to a wind that hadn't even arrived yet. The sky pressed low and gray across the valley. Just before sunset, the wind died completely, and the birds vanished from the fields. Caleb and Naomi stopped discussing improvements. Now they prepared only for survival. Marker posts went into the frozen ground at regular intervals between the house and barn. The water barrel was filled to the brim. Hay was moved as close to the barn as safely possible while preserving airflow. Every brace on the reinforced roof was checked twice. A guide rope was strung from the house door to the barn entrance. A repair bag waited by the door, packed and ready. Tobias watched the last marker post sink into the frozen earth. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Caleb tightened the final knot. The rope keeps a man from drifting too far. The posts tell him whether he's still headed somewhere. That evening, Agatha Pruitt stopped briefly on her way to shelter with relatives, leaving a jar of preserves and a quiet warning. Everett's boys say this one's bigger than last year's. Near dusk, a written notice arrived from Reddick's office. An Arctic front was moving in fast. Winds could reach 60 miles an hour. Once the snow began, no one was to leave shelter for any reason. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now Cedar Hollow would face the only judge whose opinion truly mattered. The storm arrived before dawn, exactly as the warning had promised. Wind tore across the valley, and within hours, snow had buried the lower marker posts completely. The reinforced barn roof held firm against gusts that would have torn the old shingles away in minutes. The raised hay platform stayed dry and untouched by moisture. Caleb and Naomi crossed between the house and barn one careful trip at a time, clipped to the guide rope, visibility reduced to almost nothing. By midday, a faint, desperate pounding echoed from somewhere near the fence line. Caleb followed the marker posts into the white haze and found Silas Doyle, one of Everett Cross's ranch hands, half buried in a snowdrift, his horse long gone, his face pale with frostbite. "I saw your marker posts," Silas gasped. "That's the only reason I kept walking." Caleb hauled him inside without a word. Once warmed by the stove, Silas spoke in shaking breaths. Everett's north barn roof gave way. "Cattle are trapped in one corner, can't reach water." No one answered. Silas looked toward the reinforced roof above them. The same design he had mocked only weeks earlier as overbuilt nonsense. Now it had likely saved his life. The storm tightened its grip through the second night. Before dawn, one of the older milk cows, Clementine, went into difficult labor weeks early. Naomi recognized immediately that something was wrong. The calf was turned. No veterinarian could reach the ranch through the buried roads. Whatever happened next would happen with only the hands already inside the barn. While Caleb checked the barn's structural braces against the wind, Naomi washed her hands in warm water, secured Clementine's tail, and worked slowly and carefully to turn the calf, exactly as she had once watched a veterinarian do years earlier. Tobias held the lantern steady, his hands trembling. "Keep your eyes on her," Naomi said softly. He obeyed without question. Caleb returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slipped free onto the dry straw bedding, but did not breathe. Naomi cleared its mouth quickly. Caleb rubbed its ribs briskly with clean straw. Without being asked, Tobias handed Naomi a dry towel. For one unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then the calf drew its first ragged breath. From the house, baby Ruth began to cry. Still recovering from the cold, Silas pulled the old crib closer to the stove and quietly warmed a bottle of milk without being asked. No one stood apart from the work anymore. On the third day, the wind reached its most violent peak. Just past midday, one of the newly reinforced roof braces on the barn's windward corner snapped loose under the strain. If it failed completely, snow and wind would pour directly into the barn, threatening to bury the cattle inside. Caleb grabbed the guide rope. Naomi caught the other end without needing to be asked. Outside, the storm swallowed everything beyond the nearest marker post. Caleb crawled from post to post, fighting to reach the failing brace. A loose section of roofing slammed into his shoulder, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open, tools scattering into the drift, saved only by a leather strap Sarah had once sewn years earlier. Inside, Clementine bellowed. Ruth cried from the house. Naomi gripped the rope tightly, waiting. 3 sharp tugs. Give me line. She fed more rope into the storm. Caleb reached the broken brace and wedged a spare beam across the gap, not to last forever, only to hold until morning. The rope finally went still. Naomi pulled steadily until a figure crawled out of the wideout on one arm and one knee. Caleb pushed himself upright. It'll hold till morning. Naomi looked past him into the raging storm. Morning is enough. By the 4th morning, the wind had finally begun to weaken. No one celebrated yet. They simply began counting. Every animal on the ranch was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The hay remained dry. The water barrel had not frozen solid again. The barn doors opened without needing to dig through snow. Firewood remained stacked and ready by the stove. Silas Doyle stood on his own feet once more. Caleb walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief in his hands. One brace had proven too light. 2 marker posts needed to be set deeper into the ground. The repair bag needed stronger stitching. Naomi watched him writing. You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived. Caleb closed the notebook. The living can wait an hour. A weakness shouldn't get to hide behind good luck. Later, the clouds finally broke, revealing a strip of pale gray sky. Steam rose from the cattle's breath in the cold air. The children have their milk, Naomi said quietly. Caleb studied the damaged roof brace. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them spoke of spring yet. Neither of them spoke of leaving. When the roads finally reopened, people came to Cedar Hollow seeking answers instead of rumors. Reddick arrived first, inspecting the barn, the bedding, the water system, and reading every page of the ledger from its first entry to its last. He closed the book slowly. The barn stayed dry. The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference. Every flaw you caught early was fixed before the storm ever arrived. Silas spoke next. I'd be dead out there if it weren't for those marker posts. Everett Cross arrived last. His own ranch had lost cattle, and part of his north barn roof had been torn away completely. He offered no apology, but he studied the reinforced roofline for a long moment. How'd you angle that brace? Caleb explained without hesitation. Everett listened, nodded once, and said nothing more before riding away, quietly adjusting the way he looked at the ranch he had once dismissed. That evening, Naomi brought Caleb into the small ranch office and placed a folded agreement on the desk. It granted him a share of the ranch's future earnings, authority over structural repairs and winter preparation, and one final line that stood apart from the rest. Tobias and Ruth would always have a home at Cedar Hollow, regardless of whatever happened between the 2 adults. Caleb looked up. Why give me part of something that was always yours? Naomi met his eyes steadily. I'm not giving you what was mine. I'm naming what you already carried here. That night, after the agreement was signed, they sat together beside the stove as the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the storm. The fire burned low, and neither of them rushed to fill the silence. I came here asking for milk, Caleb said finally. I never meant to owe you a life. You don't owe me one, Naomi replied, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. But there's one here, if you mean to share it. Caleb smiled, for the first time in months. I'll stay until the snow is gone. Naomi glanced toward the frost still clinging to the fence outside. Stay until the grass comes back. He looked up at her. Longer than that. They didn't marry right away. The work always came first. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt the damaged roof brace properly, and under Caleb's guidance, neighboring ranches, even Everett Crosses, slowly adopted the same winter preparation methods. It wasn't until early spring that Caleb and Naomi held a quiet wedding, witnessed only by Reddick and a few close neighbors. The celebration lasted only as long as it took to sign the papers, since Clementine was due to calve again any day. A few weeks later, Tobias looked up from the ledger. "Do I have to call you something else now?" "You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean," Naomi said gently. Tobias nodded and continued writing in silence. But weeks later, tripping near the marker posts, he blurted out, "Ma," before catching himself. Naomi rushed over to brush the dirt from his hands, pretending not to have heard it at all. Inside, though, something in her had shifted permanently. Spring returned slowly to Cedar Hollow. Near the barn post where Tobias had carved a new measuring line, little Ruth took careful, unsteady steps toward Naomi. "Ma," the small voice carried across the yard. Naomi didn't rush forward. She simply knelt down and waited patiently for the girl to finish the last few steps on her own. Caleb looked over the repaired roofline, the open barn doors, and the grazing cattle beyond the fence. "It still needs fixing," he said quietly. "That's a good thing," Naomi replied, handing him the second cup of coffee. "You said you'd stay as long as there was work." Cedar Hollow didn't survive because winter showed mercy. Winter showed none at all. It survived because every weakness was found and fixed before the storm ever came looking for it. Caleb and Naomi never rescued one another. They simply stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. And out on that quiet stretch of prairie, that lesson outlasted every winter that followed. The strongest homes are never built by people who never break. They're built by people who keep showing up, one repair at a time, until the storm finally runs out of weaknesses to find.